Welcome to this series in Media Studies A-Level for EDUCAS, and it's Component 2, Section B, Mainstream and Alternative Magazines. And this is Part 7, where the focus will be on Woman's Realm editorial. And of course, the two set texts for this topic are Hook Magazine as a form of alternative media and Woman's Realm Magazine as a form of mainstream media. And before we move on to examining and exploring the editorial, let's just remind ourselves of what we already know about Woman's Realm. Of course, it was published in 1965 by a company called IPC. And in the 1960s, if we just think of some industry perspectives, of course, in the 1960s and the 1950s, women's magazines were hugely popular and very influential. Of course, there was no social media, so this was a key form of media for many, many people. There's 12 million copies of women's magazines, physical magazines, actually sold per week out of newsagents mainly, or delivered to people's homes. And for Woman's Realm itself, there was 1.2 million per week, which is a phenomenal amount. Now, the most popular women's magazine in the 1950s and 1960s was a magazine called Woman, and this was at its peak selling 3 million copies per week. Woman's Realm was actually introduced in 1958 in order to take the pressure away from the sales, because they couldn't keep up with the demand for woman magazines. So they decided to produce Woman's Realm as a way of giving an audience something else. And of course, people might even buy both magazines. And of course, there was many popular women's magazines in the 1960s, including Woman and Woman's Realm, but also Woman's Weekly, Woman's Own, as well as a whole range of sort of home magazines. And the significant thing about these magazines, these four particularly that are on here, is that in 1963 they were all owned or taken over by one company called IPC, which stands for obviously International Publishing Corporation, and they became the owners of all these magazines plus many other magazines. Key things about IPC that we need to know: it was obviously a conglomerate, and we've done some work on conglomerates and how they take over other companies in order to make themselves more powerful. It was horizontally integrated because it owned many magazine titles, not only women's magazines but interest magazines. If you think back, or if you think about the 1960s, without social media, without television being as popular, magazines and newspapers were much more the sort of media of people, so much more popular. And it was also almost vertically integrated, so IPC, as well as owning the magazine titles, they were able to print their own magazines. They owned big factories, big printing presses. They had lorries to actually get the magazines out to newsagents. They also owned a lot of magazines abroad as well, so they were almost, but not quite, vertically integrated, because they owned production, distribution, but not quite exhibition, but they were still an extremely powerful company. So if we continue with our industry perspective and think about the work of Curran and Seaton and some of the ideas that they came up with. So Curran and Seaton say conglomerates are driven by a logic and profit and power. That is the most important thing to these companies. They want profit, they want to make money out of what they're selling, because that gives them more power. How do they get more power? The more money they got, the more other companies they can take over, the more magazine titles they can take over, so that will give them more power within the marketplace. And if you are driven by profit and power, according to Curran and Seaton, this will inhibit or stop or hold back any creative ideas, any variety in what you're producing, because of course these companies just want to sell what is already being produced, what is already selling. They don't want to take risks on things that might be more diverse, might be different, and might not sell. And of course we've got David Hesmonhalgh, who again says something similar. So conglomerates try to minimize risk and maximize audiences. How do they do this? He calls it formatting cultural products. It's using a formula, if you like, for media tax. They do the same thing. He says they do it through the use of styles and genres. So they stick to the things that already sell, the people that are popular, the genres that are popular. And again, this will lead to a lack in creativity and a lacking of diverse representations. And of course, with Woman's Realm from 1965, we can look at this as a formulaic magazine. These types of magazines were selling in their millions, so why change that? IPC would think they would just replicate what is already being sold. So Woman's Realm, we can say, lacks creative, diverse ideas, as that would involve risk. And on page 3 of Woman's Realm magazine, we have the editorial. So remember what we said about editorials when we looked at Hook magazine. This is the actual editorial bit, but they're written by the editor. So the editor is the person who is in charge of the publication, whether it's be a magazine or a newspaper. They're responsible for the content within it. It sets the tone and positions the audience, so it sort of tries to get the audience to respond in a particular way. And also it sets something called a mode of address, the way it speaks to the audience. What tone? Is it an authoritative tone? Is it a friendly tone? Is it an expert? It's that sort of thing. So what sort of mode of address is being created here, we might ask. And the editorial itself constructs a sort of very light, almost patronising tone or mode of address, where it's presuming that the audience are interested in quite frivolous, unimportant things. And the focus for this is Valentine's Day. This edition of the magazine was published on the 13th of February, the day before Valentine's Day, and it's talking about that. So we can see here, but the main focus for it is Valentine's Day. And it talks about this in quite a silly, non-serious way. And again, it's not treating its readers as having really sort of serious issues or, you know, sort of doing important things. There's little stories here. So there's this one where it talks about on Valentine's Day Eve, apparently women, if they get a hard-boiled egg, scoop out the yolk from a hard-boiled egg, fill that with salt, and then swallow the egg with the salt in it. When they go to bed that night, they will actually dream of their future husband. So quite a bizarre sort of concept. Again, quite silly, quite patronising, but also presuming that women are going to sort of want, you know, what they're going to dream about. They're going to dream about being married, and it presumes that they are going to be within a relationship, within a family. Again, towards the bottom of the page, quite a frivolous, unserious, almost patronising mode of address is constructed. So a picture of 6 sort of animals together, couples together, who are supposedly in love. And again, the emphasis on relationships. We might say this is stereotyping the interests of women. And running alongside the editorial and the images at the bottom is, of course, what we call the contents page. So obviously sort of indicating what types of things are in the rest of the magazine. So it has, again, quite stereotypical things here for women, such as cookery, knitting, fashion, beauty, and also what else are women going to do in spare time? Fiction. So they're going to read sort of stories. So these fiction stories as well. Again, creating, we might argue, a stereotype. Now, although we've been looking mainly at the industry, we can always also link this into representation. And if we think of one of our theorists, Stuart Hall, who looks at representation, I want you to sort of think about this statement from his theory. So stereotyping as a form of representation reduces people to a few simple characteristics or traits. So this allows you to be able to maybe talk about stereotyping in a bit more detail rather than just saying women are stereotypes or men are stereotypes. So stereotyping reduces people to a few simple characteristics or traits. Now, I would like you to think about that when looking at first of all the front cover and then the editorial. How is it reducing women to a few simple characteristics or traits? You know, we don't see women here as working anywhere, as business leaders, as being particularly intelligent, studying, nothing like that. It's all about other things. It's about fashion. It's about looking after children. It's about looking after the home. So what are the few simple characteristics or traits that women are reduced to within these 2 pages of the magazine? Because that links in with this concept of stereotyping.